What if the biggest mistake in this entire war wasn't made on a battlefield, but at a negotiating table? Iran's negotiators thought they were winning, and then the phone call came. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell, because this story has more twists than most people realize, and you don't want to miss where it goes next. If this kind of deep, honest breakdown is what you come here for, drop a like right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Let's start at the beginning, because you need to understand just how badly this war opened for Iran before you can understand why its negotiators are making the same mistake twice. When the first strikes landed, nobody inside Iran's military expected what came next. Within 72 hours, more than 1,700 targets across the country had been hit. Command centers, missile storage sites, radar installations, air defense batteries that Iran had spent years and billions of dollars building up, gone or badly damaged in 3 days. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Some of the aircraft used in that opening wave were B-52 bombers. Not stealth jets, not the newest, most advanced machines in the American arsenal. A bomber design that first flew in 1952. Older than most of the pilots flying it. Older than the war itself by 70 years. Think about what it means when a 70-year-old aircraft can fly into a country's airspace and strike targets with almost no resistance. That's not a story about how advanced American technology is. Everyone already knew that. This is a story about how weak Iran's actual defenses turned out to be, compared to what everyone, including Iran's own leadership, believed. Within days, American commanders were using a phrase that should have terrified anyone paying attention inside Tehran. Local air superiority. That means the sky, at least in certain areas, belonged to one side only. And it happened almost immediately. Let's slow down and really sit with what the B-52 represents here, because its presence in this war carries more weight than people realize. This aircraft can carry up to 70,000 pounds of weapons, bombs, mines, cruise missiles, all on a single airframe. It has fought in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in Kosovo, in the Long War on Terror, and now in this war against Iran. 70 years of continuous combat use, and it still hasn't been retired. There's something almost symbolic about that. A machine built during the Eisenhower era, flying missions in 2026, because Iran's air defenses collapsed so fast that even an aging bomber could operate with what one American commander described as near total impunity. Let that phrase sink in for a second. Near total impunity. That's not military jargon for we did okay. That's military language for there was almost nothing they could do to stop us. Within the first month, more than 11,000 targets had already been hit. A large share of Iran's radar and missile coverage was gone. And that opened the door for something even more significant. American bombers stopped launching missiles from far away and started flying directly over Iranian territory, dropping guided bombs from high altitude. Why does that matter so much? Because flying a bomber directly over enemy territory only makes sense once you're confident the enemy can't seriously threaten it anymore. Launching a cruise missile from hundreds of miles away is what you do when the airspace is still dangerous. Flying overhead and releasing a bomb is what you do once you've already won the fight for the sky. And there's a financial side to this too, one that rarely gets talked about but matters enormously in a war that drags on for months. A guided bomb dropped from a bomber costs around $80,000. A cruise missile costs closer to $3.5 million. Once American forces could fly bombers safely over Iran, they didn't need to burn through expensive missiles anymore. They could use cheap, precise bombs instead, and save the expensive weapons for the targets that truly needed them. That shift from missiles to bombers, from standoff strikes to direct overflight, wasn't a change in American strategy. It was a mirror. It reflected exactly how much of Iran's air defense had already been destroyed. Every time the method of attack changed, it was because Iran's ability to stop it had shrunk a little more. This is the war Iran's negotiators walked into. This is what they had already seen happen once. And somehow, months later, it looks like they're repeating the exact same mistake that caused it, just in a different form. So, let's talk about what happened at the negotiating table. Because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely frustrating if you're watching it from the outside. A ceasefire was announced in early April, tied to Iran agreeing to reopen a major shipping route that had been blocked during the fighting. It was framed, at the time, as a real breakthrough, a step toward peace. And for a while it held. By June, both countries had signed a broader understanding, one that both sides publicly called progress. But here's the problem. That agreement left the hardest, most important questions completely unresolved. It didn't touch the one issue that actually started this war in the first place, Iran's nuclear program. Instead, when negotiators sat down for formal talks afterward, they spent 2 entire days discussing shipping lanes and financial arrangements. Topics that had, according to their own framework, already been settled weeks earlier. 2 full days, and almost none of it touched the subject that mattered most. Why would experienced negotiators spend 2 days rediscussing something they'd already agreed on? Think about that for a moment, because the answer tells you everything about the strategy being used. This is a classic stalling technique. It's not new and it's not unique to this war. When a negotiating team is under serious pressure not to give up ground on one specific issue, they often steer the conversation towards smaller, safer topics instead. It lets both sides walk away from the table saying progress was made, even though the real disagreement hasn't moved an inch. Every hour spent talking about shipping routes was an hour not spent talking about centrifuges and uranium stockpiles. And that's exactly the kind of outcome you'd expect from a delegation trying very hard to avoid one specific conversation. Now, this isn't necessarily proof of bad faith in the crudest sense. It's a recognizable diplomatic move. Buy time. Look cooperative. Hope the other side's patience runs out before you're forced to make the concession. You don't want to make, but that strategy only works under one condition. The other side actually has to run out of patience. And that's exactly where Iran's negotiators appear to have miscalculated again. Because in the weeks after those talks, instead of Washington softening, the opposite happened. Reports emerged that the American president had grown openly frustrated, telling reporters that Iran simply hadn't experienced enough consequences yet to take negotiations seriously. That's not the language of a country running out of patience. That's the language of a country getting ready to apply more pressure. We're just getting into the most important part of this story, so if you've made it this far, do me a favor and share this video with someone who's been following this war too. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it keeps this kind of detailed analysis reaching more people instead of getting buried under shorter, shallower videos. Here's where things get genuinely strange, because right in the middle of this tension, Iran's side appeared to catch what looked like a real, tangible win. All 6 American B-52 bombers stationed at a Royal Air Force base in Britain left quietly, in 2 separate groups of 3. The last one was spotted leaving in early July. These were the same bombers, or the same type of aircraft, that had opened this entire war with those 1,700 targets in 72 hours. And now they were going home. Local aviation photographers caught the departures on camera. It wasn't a secret operation. It was visible, trackable, and confirmed independently by people who track military flights as a hobby. That's important, because it meant this wasn't just a government claim that could be dismissed as propaganda. Anyone with internet access could verify it was actually happening. And from Iran's side of the table, you can imagine exactly how that looked. The most symbolically powerful aircraft in the entire war, the ones that represented the opening horror of those first 3 days, were quietly leaving, heading home, winding down. Combine that with 2 days of negotiations that successfully avoided the nuclear question, and a ceasefire that was, for the moment, still holding. From a certain angle, that combination of facts could look like real disciplined negotiating finally paying off. Patience, delay, deflection. It could look like it was working. But here's the detail that got missed, or maybe ignored, inside that celebration. The bombers leaving Britain never actually meant American strike capability against Iran had disappeared. Not even close. A dozen B-1 Lancer bombers, a different but still powerful strategic aircraft, remained stationed at that same base even after the B-52s left. And beyond that, B-52s, B-1s, and even stealth B-2 bombers based back in the continental United States could all be redeployed for long-range strikes whenever the order came down. The exact same way they were used to open this war in the first place. In other words, the departure wasn't a surrender of capability. It was, at most, a pause, a withdrawal of visible symbols, not actual power. And the people who track these kinds of military movements for a living understood that immediately. One widely cited piece of reporting at the time described the movement of these aircraft as something like a barometer, a signal worth watching closely, rather than a permanent shift in the war's direction. Think about what it says when analysts trust the location of a handful of aircraft more than they trust the public statements coming from either government. That's not a small detail. That tells you just how little confidence remained in the official narratives being handed out by both sides at that point in the war. And there's a broader pattern buried in this too, one worth understanding because it shows up again and again in military history, not just in this specific war. A withdrawal of forces during a fragile ceasefire is not the same thing as a concession earned at the negotiating table. Most of the time, it's simply a conditional reciprocal gesture, tied tightly to a specific set of circumstances, holding steady. And the moment those circumstances change, there's never any real guarantee that the forces which quietly left won't just as quietly, or far less quietly, come right back. That's exactly what happened next. Only about 2 weeks after the last bomber left British soil, everything changed. The president said he was now weighing whether to restart major combat operations against Iran entirely. He said Iran wasn't ready to make a real deal, and that its leadership had, in his own words, some troubling intentions. That statement came right after Iran reportedly rejected a detailed 15-point ceasefire proposal, one that had been personally delivered by Iraq's prime minister after he'd met with the American president directly. Iran said no, and the president's response was blunt. He said Iran hadn't received enough pain yet to take these talks seriously, which strongly suggests the administration may be preparing to escalate again, using military pressure to force Iran back into real, serious negotiation instead of relying on diplomacy alone. Now line up the dates here, because the speed of this reversal is genuinely staggering once you see it laid out clearly. The last B-52 left that British base in early July. The Iraqi prime minister met with the American president less than 2 weeks later, carrying a fresh peace proposal. And within roughly another 10 days after that, the proposal had already been rejected, and the president was publicly talking about renewed major combat. That's not a slow decline in diplomatic goodwill stretched out over months. That's an entire cycle, from apparent progress to renewed threats of war, compressed into less than 4 weeks. Whatever Iran's negotiators believed they had achieved during those stalling sessions in Doha, it didn't survive contact with what came next. Let's talk about why this pattern matters so much, and why it deserves way more attention than a single news cycle usually gives it. Wars like this one rarely announce their next phase with a formal declaration. They announce it through movement, through logistics, through which forces are quietly heading home and which ones are staying exactly where they are, ready to move on short notice. Governments control what they say out loud very carefully, but equipment doesn't lie the same way statements do. Where a bomber is physically stationed tells you more about what's actually being planned than almost anything said at a podium. That's precisely why so many analysts treated that British withdrawal as a real signal worth watching, instead of dismissing it as a minor logistics update. And it's exactly why the question of whether those bombers, or others just like them, quietly return to that same base or redeploy somewhere else entirely deserves serious attention right now. Not attention after the fact, once the headlines have already moved on to the next story. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because this war is nowhere near finished, and there's a lot more of this story still coming. It really does make a difference for this channel when you do. Now let's zoom out, because there's a deeper lesson buried inside everything we've just walked through. One that goes beyond just this specific war, and applies to almost any high-stakes negotiation where one side badly misjudges how much room they actually have to maneuver. Iran has now made, essentially, the same mistake twice in this war, just in two completely different forms. The first time, it was a military miscalculation. Iranian leadership appears to have genuinely believed their air defense network was strong enough to hold against a sustained American campaign. It wasn't. It collapsed faster than almost anyone outside the country expected, and certainly faster than Iran's own military planners had prepared for. Within a month, a 70-year-old bomber was flying overhead with barely any resistance. The second time, it was a diplomatic miscalculation. Iran's negotiators appear to have believed that stalling on the hardest issues while accepting smaller, safer concessions would eventually wear down American resolve. It didn't. If anything, it seems to have hardened it. The quiet withdrawal of bombers from Britain wasn't a reward for patience. It was, at best, a temporary and conditional pause, one that evaporated the moment Iran rejected a serious peace proposal just weeks later. Both of these failures share the exact same underlying root cause. In both cases, Iran significantly overestimated how much space it actually had to work with. Whether that meant overestimating how long its air defenses could hold under sustained pressure, or overestimating how long Washington was willing to wait while its negotiators circled the same settled issues instead of addressing the one topic that actually mattered, the mistake looks nearly identical from the outside. And both times, the response from the other side followed the same basic shape. A sudden, overwhelming reassertion of pressure, specifically designed to correct whatever assumption Iran's leadership had settled into believing. Quiet didn't mean weak, patient didn't mean passive. And a pause in visible military activity never meant the underlying capability had actually gone anywhere. This is exactly why this specific moment in the war deserves more attention than just another entry in a long, exhausting cycle of strikes and ceasefires. If the pattern connecting the collapse of Iran's air defenses back in the war's opening, weeks to the collapse of its negotiating strategy, now actually holds true, then the response to this rejected ceasefire proposal is unlikely to be a slow, measured escalation. Based on everything this war has already demonstrated about how the other side reacts when it concludes that Iran's assumptions were wrong, the far more likely outcome looks a lot closer to what happened the very first time this exact dynamic played out. A sudden, overwhelming return of the same kind of air power that opened this war in the first place. So here's the real question worth sitting with as this story keeps developing. Does Iran's negotiating team still have room to walk this specific standoff back before it reaches that point again? Or has that window already closed? The same way Iran's window to strengthen its air defenses closed faster than anyone inside the country expected back when this war first began? There's something almost tragic about watching the same mistake happen twice, in two completely different forms, separated by months, but built on the exact same flawed assumption. The first time, Iran misjudged steel and radar and missile batteries. The second time, Iran misjudged patience and how long Washington was actually willing to wait. And in both cases, the warning signs were there the entire time, for anyone willing to look closely enough. The B-52s that struck 1,700 targets in 72 hours weren't a random show of force. They were a demonstration of exactly how much capability could be brought to bear, and exactly how quickly, once a decision had already been made. That demonstration should have permanently shaped how Iran's negotiators approached every single conversation that followed. Instead, it appears to have faded from their strategic thinking almost entirely, replaced by a belief that quiet diplomacy and careful stalling could somehow produce a different outcome this time. It's worth remembering something important here, too. A withdrawal of forces is never automatically the same thing as a surrender, and a temporary pause in military activity is never automatically the same thing as a permanent change in resolve. Those are two very different things, and confusing one for the other, especially at a negotiating table with this much at stake, is exactly the kind of misreading that tends to catch a delegation completely off guard the moment circumstances shift. The aircraft that opened this war with 1,700 targets in 72 hours never actually left the fight in any meaningful sense. They simply went home to wait, fully capable of returning the moment they were needed again. And based on everything said publicly just in the past week, that wait may already be coming to an end. Keep watching where those bombers are actually stationed over the coming days and weeks, because in a war like this one, the physical location of a handful of aging aircraft has already proven more than once to be a far more honest signal of what happens next than anything said out loud by either government at a podium. Statements can be carefully worded to sound reassuring. Diplomatic language can be shaped to project calm, even when the underlying situation is anything but calm. But equipment has to be somewhere. Personnel have to be stationed somewhere. And those physical realities are considerably harder to fully hide, no matter how tightly a government controls its public messaging. That's the real lesson sitting underneath this entire story, and it's one worth carrying forward into every future headline about this war, regardless of which specific negotiation or which specific aircraft happens to be making news on any given day. Wars like this one rarely announce their next chapter through a formal declaration delivered from behind a podium. They announce it quietly through logistics, through which forces are actively heading home, and which ones remain forward positioned and ready to move the instant an order comes down. Iran's negotiators appear to have read a quiet, symbolic withdrawal as proof that their strategy of delay was finally working. But everything that's happened in the weeks since suggests they read that signal exactly backwards. It wasn't a reward, it was a test. A way to see whether Iran was actually negotiating with real intentions to resolve the core issue, or simply running out the clock while hoping the pressure would eventually ease on its own. Based on the rejected proposal that followed, and based on the blunt language used afterward about Iran not having felt enough consequences yet, that test appears to have produced a very clear, very uncomfortable answer for anyone still hoping this war might quietly wind down on its own. So where does this leave things right now? Iran's leadership is once again facing a choice that looks strikingly similar to the one it faced back when this war first began. Continue believing that patience and careful delay will eventually outlast the other side's resolve. Or recognize, before it's too late this time, that the same underlying miscalculation which led to a catastrophic opening month of this war may be quietly repeating itself in a completely different form. History rarely repeats itself in exactly the same shape twice, but the underlying pattern connecting these two moments, a collapse in March built on overestimating physical defenses, and a collapse in July built on overestimating diplomatic patience, is genuinely difficult to ignore once you see the entire timeline laid out side by side, the way we just have. The opening strikes, the quiet stalling at the negotiating table, the symbolic withdrawal that felt for a brief moment like a genuine victory, and now the swift, blunt reversal that seems to be undoing all of it in a matter of weeks. If there's one thing this entire war has proven so far, it's this. Quiet does not mean weak. Distance does not mean gone. And in a conflict shaped as much by signals and misread symbols as by actual strikes on the ground, the side that misjudges how much room it truly has left tends to pay for that miscalculation in the most overwhelming way possible. Iran learned that lesson once already, in the most brutal way imaginable, when 1,700 targets fell in just 72 hours. The question now is whether that lesson will need to be taught all over again, or whether there's still, even now, a narrow window left to avoid repeating it. Watch the skies, watch the bases, watch where those bombers actually go next. Because in this war, that has already proven to be the only signal that's never once lied. What do you think happens next? Do you believe those bombers make their way back into direct combat over Iran in the coming days, essentially repeating the exact same opening sequence that started this entire war? Or do you think there's still a real, genuine chance for Iran's negotiators to pull this back from the edge before it reaches that point again? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read through every single one, and I'm genuinely curious where people are landing on this after seeing the full picture laid out. And if this video helped you understand this war a little more clearly than before you clicked on it, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Subscribe if you want to keep following this story as it develops, because based on everything covered here today, this is far from over. It's just getting started again.